Welcome back to the next episode of Jammin' Dude's Neighborhood, the second in my series of Riverside reviews. Took a week off because, it times it better for what my plan is, and also things were just a little bit busy. But we move on to number 2 in my Riverside series of album reviews, focusing on Second Life Syndrome. This is This is a lot of people's favorites, and it's certainly one of my favorites from the entire catalog. My personal favorite is ADHD, but we'll get to that later. But this is probably number 2, ironically enough. This is an amazing album. The tracks from this one were what really leapt out at me when my friend Scott Hansen first shared with me a mixed CD of Riverside songs. The first song out of the gate, which is called After, leaped out at me right away because After, and the way that it focuses on, now that I'm hearing it all in context, the Reality Dream trilogy as we're going through it now. We ended Out of Myself on kind of a very down note. He's trying to convince himself that he's okay when he's really not. Now we open up Second Life Syndrome with a bit of hope, which in and of itself ends up being kind of misleading because we find out what a mess our protagonist is as we go through this album. What a mix of emotions that we get when I really delve deep into this album. But I like the way it starts because After is a very meaningful piece for me because it opens up with that idea that I have convinced myself that I am someone that I am not, and I have to stop. I have to move forward. I have to be honest with myself. And so it's sort of this revelation that we can all experience in our lives when we don't feel like we're really being what we feel. We're always feeling like we're living up to other people's expectations. And that leads perfectly into Volte-Face, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means a turning around of your entire life. I personally have experienced this. And actually there are many stages sometimes to a revelation of this nature. But it touches me that we reach those moments in our lives when we realize that we're not doing ourselves any favors. And we can get to points in our lives when we realize that who we are, who we have become is holding our own selves back. So we now have to shed that entire idea and now move forward with honestly who we are. What makes this album and our protagonist kind of a mess, an emotional roller coaster, is that this album focuses on the relationship that he's involved in, or at least much of it. And that makes it tragic as well, because now we see that not only is this person starting off with this hope, I'm about to start being honest with myself, but now someone who has dedicated themselves to him is now going through all this turmoil. And he's not sure if the person that he's in a relationship with loves him for who he really is, or who they perceived him to be when he was trying to please everybody else. And that leads perfectly into Conceiving You. Beautiful ballad. But we see how our protagonist is unsure. Are we living this relationship on the concepts of our imagination, what we conceive each other to be, is our relationship even real at this point? Or is it just we're in love with who we're pretending to be? I should take this moment to say that I haven't done much reading up on what Marius may have meant by all of this. I'm taking this straight off at face value, just listening to the albums free of all other conceptions of all this, and just speaking from my own personal opinion and what these lyrics spoke to me as a piece of art. So we're moving forward in this, and now we're on to Second Life Syndrome, the title track, and there's so much going on here with trying to become who he is. And most of the rest of the album ends up being him wrestling with himself and kind of going back and forth on who he really is, trying to figure out if who he really is moving forward should then be in conflict. We're finding a character who is finding his confidence for the very first time. He's dead set on moving forward and finally becoming who he is, but then having the flip side of being unsure if this next step is really who he wants to become, or is he just repeating the process? But it continues. Second Life Syndrome, first of all, I should point out the musical themes too, the sections involved with, and I'm going to look at them really quick because they slip my mind, but From Hand to Mouth, the first part starting fairly straightforward in its own verse and mid-range pace. But then we get to Secret Exhibition, which is the height of this song, and with it and the atmosphere that Marius and Riverside create in the Secret Exhibition portion of the song, and especially towards the ending section where he says that I erase you now along with all of my past. Here's somebody who's trying to move forward and he wants to leave everything behind, and yet while this is happening, you're feeling for this person. This other person is involved and they've dedicated themselves to him. They're probably sitting there going, I want to be there for him while he's going through this. Well, and the whole time we're hearing our protagonist go, well, in order to go through with this, I've been fake my whole life, so you're not even in love with who I am. So I have to start moving forward and being something else. It's a tragedy from top to bottom. And it really helps you to see a situation like that from both points of view and to have sympathy for both sides. I don't necessarily think now, as opposed to the beginning when I really felt strongly for our protagonist, now we're in a situation where I'm not exactly sure if what our protagonist is doing is the right thing. So it's already taking me on an emotional roller coaster, and then it goes into, but then we go into Artificial Smile, where he's starting to realize that everybody has these moments of facade. What is the real person and what we really think? How can we separate the two? Is being polite in public, is it really lying? In my opinion, being polite in public is not necessarily a lying type of situation. It's just a matter of showing tact or being kind, even though you may have other feelings going on the inside that are tainting your reality. But here is our protagonist, and he's recognizing that there are fake things in everybody, and now he starts to hate people because of it. So now we're at a point where he's angry, he's lashing out, he sees dishonesty and hypocrisy all around him. And yet I can't help but think that this is a reflection of his self-hatred, because he somewhat sees it in himself. Because we're all prone to a little bit of this, because we all want to do our best to try to put forth an artificial smile, because it tends to smooth over our day-to-day relations when we do so. None of us want to go out into the real world and just be a jerk to everyone just because we happen to be in a bad mood. But that also tends to lend into what is the reality versus, and I think it's more nuanced and gray than that. And now we get into I Turned You Down. I Turned You Down is almost the point of breakup, leading into Reality Dream 3 and Dance with the Shadow, which is, oh my goodness, such great atmosphere on the two epic tracks, both Second Life Syndrome and Dance with the Shadow. But now we're getting into the point where the break is becoming more real. Now we're no longer at a thought process anymore. This whole album tends to go through the course of leaving the past behind, leaving a person behind, leaving personal relationships behind. And it's at this point where I start to wonder if our protagonist has gone too far, because other people have gone with him on this journey, and I don't feel like they need to be abandoned unnecessarily. One does not need to lose one's past in order to find oneself. But, be that as it may, I certainly have all this sympathy for the characters involved, because this is an emotional, tumultuous album. It's an emotionally tumultuous period in one's life. Can't forget my co-host. And it leads us to the end of the album, Before, where his transition is complete. He's changed himself. So at least I like the way it switches over from the last album, Out of Myself, which ended on such a dark moment, with him telling himself he's going to be okay when we all know he's not really okay. And now with Second Life Syndrome ending on Before, he's now opened himself up to a new light. And I'm not as familiar. There was a couple albums in this series that I picked up just before I started. Rapid Eye Movement was one of them. I am not as familiar with that album. That is one of maybe 2 or 3 albums that I had to pick up just to do this album series. And I'm going to be covering that within the next couple of weeks. But Second Life Syndrome, incredible album, one of Riverside's all-time greats. Certainly an album that encompasses the idea of turning one's life around, but should also make us self-reflect while the act of turning oneself around is certainly a positive thing, does one leave relationships behind in order to do so? And that is certainly up to personal circumstances and the listener himself. But excellent album, deep album, love all the tracks, and don't want to leave behind the idea that Piotr's guitar solos in this album, so heartfelt, especially on the 2 epic tracks. The ending, oh my goodness, the ending guitar riff in Dance with the Shadow, and also in Second Life Syndrome. Very emotionally moving, goosebump moments in a wonderful career that was cut far too short, far too soon. Next week, I'll be looking into the Voices in My Head EP, which is another one I just picked up. But until then, thank you all for tuning in, and I hope to see you on the next in the Riverside series. Thanks again for showing up, and we'll see you next time on Jammin' Dude's Neighborhood.